You know that feeling when someone thinks they're so clever, speaking in another language right in front of you, assuming you can't understand a word? Well, my manager Diane thought she was being incredibly sneaky when she started making jokes about me in French during team meetings. What she didn't realize was that I had spent 4 years studying French literature at university, and I understood every single venomous word that came out of her mouth. But more importantly, what she really didn't know was that I had been documenting everything. I'd love to know which corner of the globe you're watching from, and if this story speaks to you, make sure to subscribe. Tomorrow's video is one you absolutely can't miss. Every meeting, every conversation, every humiliating comment she thought I couldn't comprehend. Let me tell you how this corporate bully's arrogance became her ultimate downfall. My name is Alina, and 6 months ago, I thought I had landed my dream job at Morrison & Associates, a prestigious marketing firm in downtown Seattle. The office building was one of those sleek glass towers that made you feel important just walking through the lobby. The salary was excellent, the benefits were comprehensive, and the work seemed challenging but rewarding. I was hired as a senior marketing coordinator, reporting directly to Diane Chevalier, the French-born marketing director who had apparently built quite a reputation for herself in the industry. During my first week, Diane seemed professional enough. She had that effortless European sophistication that Americans often find intimidating, perfectly tailored blazers, expensive scarves, and an accent that made even mundane corporate speak sound elegant. She was in her early 40s with sharp features and an even sharper tongue, though I didn't realize just how sharp until later. Her office was decorated with awards and certificates, and she made sure everyone knew about her MBA from INSEAD and her previous work with luxury brands in Paris. The red flags started appearing during my second week. It began subtly, little comments here and there that seemed almost innocent at first. During a team meeting, while discussing a campaign proposal I had submitted, Diane would occasionally lean over to Marcus, our creative director, and whisper something in French. They would both smirk, and then Diane would turn back to the group and continue the meeting as if nothing had happened. I noticed this pattern, but initially brushed it off as simple side conversations between colleagues who happened to share a language. Marcus was this pretentious guy in his 30s who wore thick-rimmed glasses and constantly name-dropped obscure French films and philosophers. He had studied abroad in Lyon for a semester during college and seemed to think this made him practically Parisian. The way he and Diane would switch to French during meetings felt deliberately exclusionary, like they were creating their own little private club right in front of the rest of us. My first major project was developing a social media strategy for a high-end jewelry client. I had spent weeks researching the target demographic, analyzing competitor campaigns, and crafting what I believed was a comprehensive and innovative approach. The presentation was scheduled for a Friday afternoon, and I had prepared meticulously. The conference room was packed with senior executives, including the client representatives who had flown in from New York specifically for this meeting. As I presented my strategy, I noticed Diane and Marcus exchanging those familiar glances again. Midway through my presentation, while I was explaining the demographic analysis, Diane leaned toward Marcus and said something in French. I caught the words naive and amateur, but pretended not to understand. Marcus chuckled quietly, and they both looked back at me with what I now recognize as barely concealed condescension. After the presentation, the client representatives seemed genuinely impressed. They asked thoughtful questions about implementation timelines and budget allocation, and I felt confident that I had delivered solid work. However, as soon as the clients left the room, Diane's demeanor shifted completely. "Elena, could you stay behind for a moment?" she asked, her tone suddenly ice-cold. Once the room emptied, she closed the door and turned to face me. "That presentation was completely unacceptable," she said bluntly. "The research was superficial, the strategy lacked sophistication, and frankly, I'm embarrassed that we presented this to such an important client." I was stunned. The feedback seemed to come out of nowhere, especially considering the positive response from the actual clients. "I'm sorry you feel that way," I managed to say. "Could you be more specific about which areas need improvement?" Diane launched into a harsh critique that felt personal rather than professional. She questioned my understanding of luxury markets, criticized my presentation style, and suggested that perhaps I wasn't quite ready for this level of responsibility. As she spoke, Marcus nodded along, occasionally adding his own pointed observations about how campaigns needed more European sensibility to truly succeed in the luxury space. The most humiliating part came when Diane said, "Perhaps you should observe how we handle these presentations before taking the lead on another one." She then turned to Marcus and added in French, "Elle est vraiment pas à la hauteur. She's really not up to standard." Marcus laughed and responded, also in French, "C'est évident qu'elle ne comprend rien au luxe. It's obvious she doesn't understand anything about luxury." I kept my expression neutral, pretending I hadn't understood their exchange, but inside I was burning with anger and humiliation. These weren't constructive professional critiques. They were personal attacks delivered in a language they assumed I couldn't comprehend. That weekend, I went home to my small apartment in Capitol Hill and seriously considered looking for another job. I had moved to Seattle specifically for this opportunity, leaving behind friends and a decent position in Portland. The thought of starting over again felt overwhelming, but the idea of enduring months more of this treatment seemed equally unbearable. However, something about the situation bothered me beyond just the personal hurt. Diane's behavior wasn't just unprofessional. It felt like systematic harassment disguised as management. I started thinking about the other team members and whether they had experienced similar treatment. Sarah, a junior designer who had started a month before me, always seemed nervous around Diane. Tom, our data analyst, had mentioned feeling excluded from strategic discussions despite his expertise. By Sunday evening, I had made a decision. I wasn't going to quit and crawl away defeated. Instead, I was going to document everything. If Diane wanted to play games and abuse her position, I would make sure there was a clear record of her behavior. Monday morning arrived with the typical Seattle drizzle, and I walked into the Morrison & Associates building with a different mindset. I had downloaded a voice recording app on my phone and purchased a small digital recorder that could easily fit in my jacket pocket. My plan was simple: document every interaction, every meeting, every inappropriate comment that Diane thought I couldn't understand. The opportunity came sooner than expected. During our weekly team meeting, we were discussing a potential campaign for a French skincare brand that was looking to enter the American market. It was exactly the kind of project that played to Diane's strengths, and she was clearly excited about the prospect of working with a company from her homeland. As we brainstormed initial concepts, I suggested focusing on the brand's heritage and artisanal approach, which seemed to resonate with current consumer trends toward authentic small-batch products. Diane listened to my idea with a neutral expression, then turned to Marcus and said in French, "Elle pense vraiment qu'elle comprend le marché français. She really thinks she understands the French market." Marcus replied, "C'est adorable. Sa naïveté." Her naivety is adorable. My phone was recording everything from my purse, capturing not just their words, but also their dismissive laughter. I continued participating in the meeting as if nothing had happened, building on my initial concept and incorporating feedback from other team members. By the end of the session, we had developed what seemed like a solid foundation for the pitch. After the meeting, Diane approached me privately. "Elena, I think you should step back from this particular project," she said. "French brands require a very specific cultural understanding that, frankly, I don't think you possess." I wanted to ask her exactly what cultural understanding she thought I lacked, but instead I simply nodded and said, "Of course, whatever you think is best for the client." As she walked away, I heard her mutter in French, "Au moins elle ne résiste pas." At least she doesn't resist. That phrase stuck with me for the rest of the day. the casual cruelty of it, the assumption that I was simply too ignorant to understand. What was happening felt like a slap in the face, but it also confirmed that my decision to document everything was absolutely the right choice. Over the following weeks, I established a routine. Every morning, I would ensure my recording devices were charged and ready. I became hyper-aware of Diane's patterns, when she was most likely to make her French comments, which meetings tended to trigger her condescending behavior, and how she interacted differently with various team members. The documentation revealed a disturbing pattern. Diane consistently undermined me in front of clients and colleagues, often using French to make derogatory comments that she assumed I couldn't understand. She would praise my work to my face during one-on-one meetings, then immediately criticize it to others in what she thought was a private language. During a presentation to a potential automotive client, I had prepared a comprehensive digital marketing strategy that incorporated both traditional and innovative approaches. The client seemed engaged throughout my presentation, asking detailed questions and taking notes. However, midway through, Diane interrupted to add her own commentary. "What Elena is presenting here is certainly thorough," she said, "though I think we need to consider some more sophisticated approaches to reach this particular demographic." She then turned to Marcus and said in French, "Son approche est si basique, c'est embarrassant." Her approach is so basic, it's embarrassing. Marcus nodded and added, "On dirait qu'elle n'a jamais travaillé avec de vrais clients." It's like she's never worked with real clients before. Meanwhile, my phone continued recording every word from my blazer pocket. I maintained my professional composure, thanked Diane for her input, and continued with the presentation. The client ultimately signed with us, specifically mentioning that they appreciated the comprehensive nature of the strategy I had presented. Yet in the follow-up meeting, Diane took full credit for the successful pitch, barely acknowledging my contribution. When the client specifically asked to work with me on implementation, Diane smoothly redirected the conversation, suggesting that she would personally oversee all aspects of the campaign to ensure the highest quality standards. The pattern became increasingly blatant. During creative reviews, Diane would consistently shoot down my ideas, often with French asides to Marcus about my supposed lack of creativity or market understanding. When I would later see similar concepts approved for other campaigns, concepts that bore striking resemblance to my rejected proposals, I began to understand that this wasn't about the quality of my work. This was about control, about maintaining a hierarchy where Diane remained the unquestioned expert on all things sophisticated and European. A lot of love and effort went into bringing this story to life. If you're enjoying it, we'd be so grateful if you'd subscribe to our channel. Now, back to where we left off. The breaking point came during a company-wide presentation in November. Morrison & Associates was pitching for a massive contract with a luxury hotel chain, and this presentation would determine whether we secured what could be the biggest account in the firm's history. The entire senior leadership team would be present, along with executives from the hotel chain. I had been working on this pitch for over a month, developing a comprehensive brand repositioning strategy that would help the hotel chain appeal to younger luxury travelers while maintaining their traditional elegance. The research had been extensive, involving focus groups, competitor analysis, and trend forecasting. I was genuinely proud of the work and excited about the presentation. The morning of the pitch, Diane called me into her office. "Elena, I've been reviewing your presentation materials," she began, "and I think we need to make some adjustments." She proceeded to essentially gut my entire presentation, removing key sections and replacing them with generic marketing speak that eliminated most of the innovative elements I had developed. When I tried to object, explaining the research behind my strategic choices, she cut me off. "This is a multi-million-dollar account," she said sharply. "We can't afford to take risks with untested approaches." Then, turning to Marcus, who had just entered the office, she said in French, Elle n'a vraiment aucune idée de ce qu'elle fait avec un client de ce niveau. She really has no idea what she's doing with a client of this level. Marcus laughed and replied, Il faut la tenir en laisse. She needs to be kept on a leash. That was it. That was the moment I realized that no amount of hard work, no level of professionalism, no degree of competence would ever be enough for Diane. In her mind, I would always be the naive American who couldn't possibly understand the sophisticated world she inhabited. But what Diane didn't realize was that every cruel word, every dismissive comment, every moment of what she thought was private mockery had been captured and preserved. My phone had been recording faithfully for months, building an undeniable record of systematic harassment and professional sabotage. As I sat in that office, listening to them laugh about keeping me on a leash, I felt something shift inside me. The hurt and frustration that had been building for months crystallized into something much more focused and determined. Diane had been playing a game where she thought she held all the cards, where her linguistic advantage gave her the power to humiliate and belittle without consequence. She was about to learn just how wrong she had been. The hotel chain presentation was scheduled for 2 p.m. in the main conference room. As I walked through the hallway that afternoon, my modified presentation materials tucked under my arm, I could feel the weight of the small recorder in my jacket pocket. What Diane didn't know was that I had been meticulously cataloging not just her French insults, but also the systematic way she had been stealing credit for my work and undermining my professional development. The conference room was impressive, floor to ceiling. Windows overlooking Elliott Bay, a massive mahogany table, and enough intimidation factor to make even seasoned executives nervous. The hotel chain's leadership team had flown in from their headquarters in Atlanta: CEO Patricia Blackwell, CMO Robert Chen, and brand director Jennifer Walsh. These weren't people you got second chances with. As we filed into the room, I noticed Diane had positioned herself at the head of the table, with Marcus to her right, and me relegated to a corner seat where I'd be barely visible to the clients. She had clearly orchestrated the seating arrangement to maximize her prominence while minimizing mine. Ladies and gentlemen, Diane began, her accent lending an air of sophistication to her opening remarks. We're thrilled to present a revolutionary approach to luxury hospitality marketing that will transform how your guests perceive and interact with your brand. What followed was essentially my presentation, delivered with Diane's European flair, but stripped of all the innovative elements. That made it unique. She spoke confidently about market research that I had conducted, demographic insights I had uncovered, and strategic positioning that I had developed over weeks of careful analysis. Halfway through, Patricia Blackwell interrupted with a question about the younger demographic data. This research on millennial luxury travelers is fascinating, she said. Who conducted this analysis? Without missing a beat, Diane replied, Our team worked collaboratively on this research, though I personally oversaw the methodology to ensure we captured the nuanced preferences of luxury consumers. I sat there, watching my work being claimed by someone else, my months of effort being repackaged as Diane's expertise. But I also noticed something else. Marcus was taking notes, and occasionally he would lean over and whisper something to Diane in French. During a brief break when the hotel executives stepped out to take calls, Diane and Marcus huddled together near the window. I pretended to review my notes while activating the voice recorder on my phone. Cette présentation se passe mieux que prévu, Diane said quietly. This presentation is going better than expected. Marcus nodded and replied, Heureusement qu'on a enlevé toutes ces idées stupides. Fortunately, we removed all her stupid idea. Elle ne sait même pas qu'on utilise son travail. Diane laughed. She doesn't even know we're using her work. Le plus drôle, c'est qu'elle pense encore qu'elle va avoir une promotion, Marcus added with a smirk. The funniest part is she still thinks she's going to get a promotion. That last comment hit me like a physical blow. For months, Diane had been dangling the possibility of a senior position, using it to extract additional hours and effort from me. Now I understood it had all been a lie, a way to keep me motivated while she systematically appropriated my contributions. When the hotel executives returned, the presentation continued with Diane fielding most of their questions while occasionally deferring to Marcus for creative insights. I might as well have been invisible, despite the fact that probably 80% of the content originated from my research and strategic thinking. Near the end of the meeting, Robert Chen asked a technical question about digital attribution models that neither Diane nor Marcus could adequately answer. There was an awkward pause as they looked at each other, clearly out of their depth. "Actually," I interjected from my corner seat, "I can address that." I proceeded to explain the attribution methodology in detail, drawing on my background in data analytics and recent certification in advanced marketing measurement. The hotel executives were clearly impressed, asking follow-up questions that demonstrated genuine interest in the technical aspects of campaign optimization. After I finished explaining, Patricia Blackwell looked directly at me and said, "That was extremely insightful. You clearly have a deep understanding of the measurement challenges we're facing." Diane's smile looked strained as she quickly jumped back into the conversation. "Yes, Elena has been developing her technical skills under my mentorship. It's wonderful to see her growth." Later, as we were packing up our materials, Diane approached me with what appeared to be a conciliatory gesture. "You did well today, Elena. Your technical explanation was quite helpful." But then she moved closer and added in French, "Même un singe aveugle trouve parfois une banane." Even a blind monkey sometimes finds a banana. I maintained my neutral expression while my phone captured every word. Her ability to insult me to my face while appearing supportive to any onlookers was truly remarkable in its calculated cruelty. The following week brought news that we had won the hotel account, a victory that would significantly boost Morrison and Associates' profile and generate millions in revenue. There was a company-wide celebration, complete with champagne and congratulatory speeches from the senior partners. During the celebration, managing partner Charles Morrison made a point of publicly thanking Diane for her exceptional leadership and strategic vision in securing such a prestigious client. The applause was thunderous, and Diane graciously accepted the accolades while I stood in the back of the room, watching my work being celebrated under someone else's name. But that evening, I received an unexpected email from Patricia Blackwell herself. She had somehow obtained my direct contact information and wanted to discuss the possibility of me leading a specialized digital transformation initiative for their brand. The email was professional, but clearly indicated that she saw me as the primary technical expert from our team. When I showed the email to Diane the next morning, her reaction was immediate and harsh. "This is completely inappropriate," she snapped. "All client communications must go through me as the account director. You should have forwarded this immediately without responding." I explained that I hadn't responded yet and was simply informing her of the client's request, but she cut me off. "This is exactly the kind of overreach that concerns me about your professional judgment," she said coldly. "Perhaps you need a reminder about proper client relationship management." She then turned to her computer and began typing what I assumed was her response to Patricia, likely redirecting all future communications through herself. As she typed, she muttered in French, "Elle se prend vraiment pour quelqu'un d'important maintenant." She really thinks she's someone important now. That afternoon, I was called into a meeting with Diane and HR Director Linda Foster. Linda was a stern woman in her 50s who had been with the company for over a decade and typically handled serious disciplinary matters. "Elena, we need to discuss some concerns about your recent behavior," Linda began, consulting a file on her desk. What followed was a surreal experience where I was essentially reprimanded for being too competent. Diane had crafted a narrative suggesting that I was overstepping boundaries, attempting to circumvent proper channels, and displaying an inappropriate level of ambition that was disrupting team dynamics. "We value initiative," Linda continued, But it's important to remember that junior staff members need to respect established hierarchies and communication protocols. I listened in stunned silence as Diane painted my technical expertise and client interest as character flaws requiring correction. She spoke with such authority and conviction that I could see Linda nodding along, accepting this twisted version of events as fact. Moving forward, Diane concluded, I think it would be beneficial for Elena to focus more on supporting existing projects rather than taking independent initiative on strategic matters. Essentially, I was being demoted without the formal title change. My responsibilities would be reduced, my client contact eliminated, and my role transformed into something resembling an administrative assistant with a marketing degree. As we left the HR office, Diane looked almost pleased with herself. I hope you understand this is for your own professional development, she said with fake concern. Sometimes we need to slow down and master the fundamentals before advancing. Then, in French, she added, Maintenant elle sait qui commande ici. Now she knows who's in charge here. That evening, I sat in my apartment reviewing the recordings I had accumulated over the past several months. The audio files painted a clear picture of systematic harassment, professional sabotage, and discriminatory behavior that went far beyond simple workplace friction. I had documented instances of Diane stealing credit for my work, deliberately excluding me from opportunities, making derogatory comments about my abilities in a language she assumed I couldn't understand, and now actively working to undermine my career advancement. But I also realized I needed more than just recordings. Corporate harassment cases require documentation that clearly demonstrates patterns of behavior and their impact on career development. I began compiling a comprehensive dossier, performance reviews, email communications, project timelines, and client feedback that contradicted Diane's narrative about my abilities. I also started reaching out to former colleagues and industry contacts, carefully building a network of professional references who could speak to my capabilities independent of Diane's influence. Sarah, the junior designer who had left Morrison & Associates 2 months earlier, was particularly helpful. During our coffee meeting, she revealed that she had experienced similar treatment from Diane. She made my life miserable, Sarah confided, always criticizing my work in front of clients, then taking credit when something succeeded. I finally couldn't take it anymore. Did she ever make comments in French around you? I asked carefully. Sarah's eyes widened. All the time. Her and Marcus would have these little conversations, usually right after I'd present something. I always wondered what they were saying. This conversation confirmed that Diane's behavior wasn't targeted specifically at me. It was a pattern of workplace bullying that she had been getting away with for years. The French comments were her signature move, a way to humiliate and demean employees while maintaining plausible deniability. Over the next few weeks, I continued documenting everything while playing the role of the chastened employee. I arrived early, stayed late, and performed every task with meticulous attention to detail. Outwardly, I appeared to have accepted my reduced role, but internally I was building an airtight case against Diane's leadership. The breakthrough came when I discovered that Morrison & Associates had recently implemented a new diversity and inclusion policy, complete with mandatory training and a zero-tolerance stance on workplace harassment. The policy specifically mentioned that harassment could include exclusionary behavior based on language barriers and cultural differences. Also learned that the company had hired a new director of human resources, replacing Linda Foster, who had retired unexpectedly. The new HR director, Michelle Rodriguez, had a background in employment law and a reputation for taking workplace misconduct seriously. But perhaps most importantly, I discovered that Patricia Blackwell had been asking other team members about me, specifically inquiring why I wasn't more involved in the ongoing hotel campaign implementation. Her questions were creating ripples of awareness about the disconnect between my apparent expertise and my actual role on the project. All of these pieces were converging into an opportunity, but I knew I needed to be strategic about timing and approach. Diane had underestimated me once by assuming I couldn't understand French. I wasn't going to let her underestimate me again by moving too quickly or without proper preparation. The perfect moment would come soon enough, and when it did, I would be ready with months of evidence, a clear pattern of misconduct, and enough professional support to ensure that Diane's reign of linguistic terrorism would finally come to an end. The opportunity I had been waiting for arrived in early December, wrapped in the most unexpected package. Morrison & Associates was hosting their annual holiday party, a lavish affair held at the Columbia Tower Club with panoramic views of Seattle's skyline. It was the kind of event where alcohol flowed freely, professional guards came down, and people said things they normally kept to themselves. I had spent weeks preparing for this moment, organizing my evidence into a compelling narrative that would be impossible to dismiss. The recordings were transcribed and translated. The pattern of harassment was clearly documented, and I had secured supporting testimony from 3 former employees who had experienced similar treatment under Diane's management. But I wasn't planning to make my move at the party itself. Instead, I was using the event as an opportunity to gather one final piece of evidence, something so damning that it would eliminate any possibility of corporate spin or damage control. The party was in full swing when I arrived, fashionably late in a black cocktail dress that projected confidence without appearing threatening. The room buzzed with conversation, laughter, and the clinking of champagne glasses. I spotted Diane, near the windows, holding court with several senior partners and looking particularly pleased with herself. She had recently been nominated for the Pacific Northwest Marketing Executive of the Year award, largely based on the success of campaigns that originated from my work. Marcus was beside her, as always, playing his role as the sophisticated creative director. They were both slightly tipsy, which I knew from experience made them more careless with their French commentary. I activated my recording app and moved closer to their group, positioning myself near a high-top table where I could appear to be casually mingling while actually eavesdropping. The conversation was typical corporate party fare, discussions about year-end bonuses, vacation plans, and industry gossip. But then, managing partner Charles Morrison joined their circle, and the topic shifted to personnel decisions for the upcoming year. "Diane, I wanted to discuss your team structure for 2025, Charles began. "We're looking at some reorganization, particularly around the digital specialization roles." I saw Diane's expression tighten slightly. The company had been under pressure from clients to demonstrate more advanced digital capabilities, and my technical expertise had become increasingly valuable as more brands demanded sophisticated measurement and attribution strategies. "Of course, Charles," Diane replied smoothly. "I've been thinking we might need to bring in some additional senior-level expertise from outside the organization. Actually, I've been hearing interesting feedback about Alina's technical work," Charles continued. "Patricia Blackwell specifically mentioned her presentation on attribution modeling. Perhaps we should consider expanding her role rather than hiring externally." This was clearly not what Diane wanted to hear. I watched her jaw clench as she forced a diplomatic smile. "Alina certainly has potential," she said carefully, "though I think she needs more mentoring before taking on senior-level responsibilities." Charles nodded and moved on to other topics, but I could see that Diane was visibly agitated by the suggestion. As soon as he walked away, she grabbed Marcus by the arm and led him to a quieter corner of the room. I followed at a distance, pretending to examine the holiday decorations while keeping them within range of my phone's microphone. "Cette situation devient problématique," Diane hissed in French. "This situation is becoming problematic." Marcus looked around nervously before responding. "Qu'est-ce qu'on peut faire? Charles semble impressionné par son travail." "What can we do? Charles seems impressed by her work. Il faut qu'on trouve un moyen de se débarrasser d'elle," Diane replied, her voice dripping with venom. "We need to find a way to get rid of her." "Comment?" Marcus asked. "How?" Diane paused, taking a long sip of her wine before answering. "On va créer une situation où elle échoue publiquement. Quelque chose d'assez grave pour justifier son licenciement. We're going to create a situation where she fails publicly. Something serious enough to justify firing her. Tu penses à quoi exactement? Marcus pressed. What exactly are you thinking? Le projet avec les hôtels a une phase critique en janvier. Si quelque chose allait mal, si des erreurs importantes apparaissent, elle serait la responsable parfaite. The hotel project has a critical phase in January. If something went wrong, if major errors appeared, she would be the perfect scapegoat. Marcus looked uncomfortable with the direction of the conversation. Diane, c'est dangereux. Si on se fait prendre, on ne se fera pas prendre. Diane cut him off sharply. We won't get caught. Elle ne comprend pas un mot de français, et personne d'autre ne sait ce qu'on dit. What they were discussing was nothing short of professional sabotage, a deliberate plan to undermine a major client project and frame me for the failure. It was criminal behavior disguised as corporate politics, and they were planning it in plain sight, because they believed their linguistic privilege made them untouchable. I continued recording as they refined their scheme. Diane outlined a plan to introduce errors into the hotel campaign's digital tracking systems, creating attribution, failures that would appear to be the result of my technical incompetence. Marcus would support the narrative by pointing to supposed flaws in my measurement methodology, while Diane would reluctantly accept responsibility for trusting someone who wasn't ready for such critical work. The conversation lasted nearly 15 minutes, during which they discussed timing, implementation details, and how to present the failure to both the client and company leadership. It was a masterclass in workplace manipulation, delivered with the casual confidence of people who had never faced consequences for their actions. As they concluded their planning session, Diane raised her glass in a mock toast. À la fin de vie. La carrière d'Elena, she said with a cruel smile. To the end of Elena's career. Santé? Marcus replied, clinking his glass against hers. I had heard enough. Actually, I had heard more than enough. I had captured a detailed confession of conspiracy to commit professional sabotage and career destruction. But more importantly, I had recorded proof that their harassment of me was intentional, systematic, and ongoing. The next morning, I scheduled a meeting with Michelle Rodriguez, the new HR director. I had researched her background thoroughly and knew she had previously handled several high-profile workplace discrimination cases at her previous company. Her reputation suggested she was someone who would take documented harassment seriously and act decisively to protect both employees and the company. Michelle's office was smaller than her predecessors, but felt more welcoming, with warm lighting and comfortable seating that suggested a more approachable management style. She greeted me with professional courtesy, but I could see curiosity in her eyes. It wasn't common for employees to request formal meetings with HR without their direct supervisor's knowledge. Thank you for meeting with me, I began. I need to report a serious pattern of workplace harassment that has been ongoing for several months. Michelle's expression immediately became more serious. She pulled out a legal pad and opened a digital recording device. Please tell me everything, starting from the beginning. What followed was the most nerve-wracking hour of my professional life. I methodically presented my case, starting with the pattern of exclusionary behavior and moving through the systematic credit theft, the deliberate career sabotage, and finally the French language harassment that Diane assumed I couldn't understand. Wendy. I played the first recording of Diane calling me naive and amateur. Michelle's eyebrows raised slightly. By the time I reached the recordings of them discussing keeping me on a leash and referring to me as a blind monkey, her expression had hardened into barely controlled anger. But it was the holiday party recording that sealed Diane's fate. As Michelle listened to the detailed plan for professional sabotage, I watched her take increasingly rapid notes. When the recording reached Diane's toast, to the end of Elena's career, Michelle stopped writing and looked directly at me. You understand that what you've documented here represents not just harassment, but potentially criminal conspiracy. she said carefully. I nodded. I understand the seriousness of the allegations. That's why I've been so methodical about documentation. Michelle spent the next 30 minutes reviewing my supporting evidence, the pattern of stolen credit, the performance reviews that contradicted Diane's narrative about my abilities, the client feedback that demonstrated my actual competence level, and the testimony from former employees who had experienced similar treatment. This is one of the most comprehensive harassment documentation packages I've ever seen, she finally said. But you understand that pursuing this will likely result in significant changes to your work environment. I understand, I replied. But I also understand that if I don't pursue this, Diane will continue harassing other employees, and she'll eventually succeed in destroying my career through fabricated failures. Michelle leaned back in her chair, clearly processing the implications of what I had presented. I need to be completely transparent with you about what happens next. This level of documented harassment, particularly the conspiracy to sabotage your work, requires immediate investigation and likely immediate action. There's no way to handle this quietly. I didn't expect it to be quiet, I said. I expected it to be thorough. That afternoon, Michelle met with managing partner Charles Morrison and the other senior partners to present my case. I wasn't privy to that conversation, but I learned later that the recordings had prompted an emergency executive session that lasted well into the evening. By the next morning, the corporate machinery was in motion. An external employment law firm was retained to conduct an independent investigation. Diane was placed on immediate administrative leave pending the investigation's outcome, and Marcus was suspended from client-facing responsibilities. The investigation moved with surprising speed, largely because the evidence was so comprehensive and undeniable. The outside attorneys interviewed multiple employees, reviewed project records, and analyzed the pattern of behavior I had documented. Within a week, they had corroborated the harassment allegations and confirmed that company policies had been systematically violated. Patricia Blackwell was contacted as part of the investigation, and her response was immediate and definitive. She confirmed that she had specifically requested to work with me based on my technical expertise, and she expressed concern that her requests had been systematically redirected without her knowledge. More damaging to Diane's position, Patricia revealed that she had been considering switching to a different agency because of communication problems and lack of direct access to the technical expertise she valued. The investigation also uncovered evidence of Diane's harassment of other employees, including 2 instances where promising junior staff members had left the company after conflicts with her management style. The pattern was clear and undeniable. Diane had been using her position to systematically undermine employees she perceived as threats to her authority. But perhaps most importantly, the investigation revealed that Diane's behavior had been putting the company at legal and financial risk. The French-language harassment created potential liability for discrimination based on national origin, while the conspiracy to sabotage client work represented a breach of fiduciary duty that could have resulted in massive financial losses and reputational damage. As I sat in my apartment that Friday evening, exactly 1 week after my meeting with Michelle, I received a call that would change everything. It was Charles Morrison himself, asking if I could meet with him first thing Monday morning to discuss my future with the company. Monday morning arrived with the kind of crisp December clarity that made Seattle's skyline look like a postcard. I dressed carefully in my best navy suit, professional, confident, but not celebratory. I had no idea what Charles Morrison wanted to discuss, and I wasn't about to assume anything about the outcome of the investigation. The Morrison and Associates. Building felt different as I walked through the lobby. Word had clearly spread about Diane's suspension, and I could feel eyes following me as I made my way to the elevator. Some looks were curious, others sympathetic, and a few seemed almost accusatory, as if I had somehow betrayed an unspoken code by challenging a superior. Charles Morrison's office occupied the entire corner of the 42nd floor, with windows facing both the Sound and the mountains. It was intimidating by design. Rich mahogany furniture, leather-bound legal texts, and photographs of Charles with various political and business leaders. This was where careers were made and destroyed, where the future of the firm was decided. But as I entered, I was surprised to find that Charles wasn't alone. Michelle Rodriguez sat at the conference table, along with a woman I didn't recognize, an elegant black woman in her 50s wearing a charcoal gray suit that screamed senior executive. "Elena, thank you for coming," Charles began, gesturing toward an empty chair. "I'd like you to meet Rebecca Washington, our new Senior Vice President of Operations. She's been brought in specifically to address some organizational challenges we've identified." Rebecca extended her hand with a firm grip and a direct gaze that suggested she was someone who didn't waste time on corporate pleasantries. "Ms. Carter, I've reviewed your documentation extensively. What you've presented represents some of the most thorough evidence of workplace harassment I've encountered in 20 years of corporate management." I felt a mixture of relief and apprehension. The tone was professional, but I still wasn't sure whether I was being thanked or prepared for bad news. Charles leaned forward, his expression serious. "Let me be direct about where we stand. The investigation has concluded that Diane Chevalier engaged in systematic harassment, discrimination, and conspiracy to damage both your career and our client relationships. Her employment with Morrison & Associates was terminated Friday afternoon." The words hit me like a physical release of tension I hadn't realized I was carrying. Months of careful documentation, strategic planning, and emotional restraint had led to this moment. Diane was gone. "Marcus Webb has also been terminated," Rebecca added. While his level of culpability was somewhat less than Ms. Chevalier, he was an active participant in harassment and showed a clear pattern of enabling discriminatory behavior. Michelle opened a folder and slid a document across the table. "We're also implementing immediate policy changes to prevent this type of harassment in the future. All management staff will undergo mandatory sensitivity training. We're instituting a multilingual harassment reporting system, and we're creating an independent ombudsman position to handle workplace conflicts." I scanned the document, impressed by the comprehensiveness of the policy reforms. These weren't cosmetic changes designed to protect the company from liability. They represented a genuine commitment to cultural transformation. But Charles wasn't finished. "Now, let's talk about your future here." The investigation revealed not just harassment, but also systematic suppression of your contributions and capabilities. "We need to address that immediately." Rebecca pulled out another document. "Effective immediately, you're being promoted to Director of Digital Strategy, reporting directly to me rather than through the marketing department hierarchy. Your salary is being increased by 40%, and you'll have your own team of 3 junior analysts." I stared at the promotion letter, hardly believing what I was reading. 6 months ago, I had been fighting just to get credit for my own work. Now I was being offered a senior leadership position with real authority and resources. "There's more," Charles continued. "Patricia Blackwell has specifically requested that you lead a new digital transformation initiative for their entire hotel portfolio. It's a 3-year contract worth approximately $8 million. She was quite clear that her confidence in this project depends entirely on your direct involvement." The irony was almost overwhelming. Diane's efforts to exclude me from client relationships had backfired spectacularly. By trying to hide my capabilities, she had created a situation where the client's confidence was tied specifically to my expertise. Michelle leaned forward. "We also want to discuss the French language skills you demonstrated during this process. We had no idea you were fluent, and that capability could be valuable for our international client development." I smiled slightly. "I studied French literature at university. 4 years of Baudelaire and Proust tend to give you a pretty comprehensive vocabulary, including words that people probably shouldn't use in professional settings." Rebecca laughed. "I imagine so. We'd like you to consider leading our European expansion strategy. We've been trying to break into the Paris and London markets for years. but we've lacked someone with both the cultural knowledge and the strategic expertise to make it work. The conversation continued for another hour, covering everything from team building to budget authority to international travel expectations. By the time I left Charles's office, my career had been transformed beyond anything I could have imagined when I first started documenting Diane's harassment. But the most satisfying moment came as I was walking back to my desk, now a temporary arrangement while my new office was being prepared. I passed the conference room where Diane used to hold her team meetings, the same room where she had made countless derogatory comments in French while assuming I couldn't understand. Sarah Martinez, who had been promoted to replace Marcus as creative director, was leading a brainstorming session with the remaining team members. As I walked by, she caught my eye and smiled, giving me a small thumbs up. The atmosphere in the room was completely different, collaborative, respectful, and inclusive. Later that afternoon, I received a call from Patricia Blackwell. "Elena, I just heard about your promotion. I have to say, I'm not entirely surprised. It was obvious from our first meeting that you were the real expertise behind that campaign." "Thank you, Patricia. I'm excited about the digital transformation project." "Good, because I have some additional ideas I'd like to discuss. But first, I have to ask, how did you end up working under someone who was so obviously threatened by your capabilities?" I paused, considering how much to share. Let's just say that some people make assumptions about what others can and cannot understand. Those assumptions don't always work out well for them. Patricia laughed. "I have a feeling there's more to that story, but I respect your discretion. What I will say is that we've been burned before by agencies that promise expertise but deliver ego. It's refreshing to work with someone who actually knows what they're talking about." That evening, I sat in my apartment with a glass of wine, finally allowing myself to process what had happened. The small digital recorder that had started this entire journey sat on my coffee table, no longer needed but somehow symbolic of the power of preparation and persistence. My phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. For a moment, I wondered if it might be Diane, but the message was from Tom Richardson, our former data analyst who had left the company 3 months earlier. "Heard through the grapevine about what happened. Just wanted to say thank you. Diane made my life hell for 2 years, but I never had the courage to document it like you did. You probably saved a lot of people from going through what we experienced." Similar messages arrived throughout the week from former colleagues, industry, contacts, and even people I had never met who had somehow heard about the case. It seemed that Diane's reputation for harassment was more widespread than I had realized, and my actions had given others permission to speak about their own experiences. The following Monday, I moved into my new office, a corner space with natural light and enough room for the team I would be building. As I was arranging my books on the shelves, Michelle Rodriguez stopped by. "How are you settling in?" she asked. "It's surreal, honestly. 6 months ago, I was fighting just to get my voice heard in meetings." "That's the thing about workplace harassment," Michelle said. "It's designed to make people feel powerless, to convince them that they're the problem. But when someone has the courage to document the truth and demand accountability, it can transform an entire organization." She handed me a business card. "I've been contacted by 3 other companies asking about our harassment investigation procedures. Apparently, word has spread in the industry about how thoroughly we handled this case. Would you be willing to speak at a few conferences about documentation strategies for workplace harassment? I think your story could help a lot of people." I looked at the card. It was for a major professional development conference focused on workplace equity and inclusion. I'd be honored to help. As Michelle left, I turned back to organizing my office and noticed something that made me smile. Through my window, I could see the conference room where this entire journey had begun, where Diane had first made those dismissive comments in French, confident that her linguistic privilege made her untouchable. She had been wrong about so many things. Wrong about my capabilities, wrong about my language skills, wrong about my willingness to fight back, and most importantly, wrong about the consequences of systematic harassment in a modern workplace. But perhaps her biggest mistake had been underestimating the power of simply paying attention and being prepared. In the end, it wasn't courage or brilliance that had brought her down. It was careful documentation and the willingness to hold someone accountable for their actions. The small recorder on my coffee table at home had become something much larger. Proof that in the right circumstances, truth really could triumph over power. 3 months into my new role as Director of Digital Strategy, I was preparing for what would become the most important presentation of my career. The European expansion proposal I had been developing was scheduled to be presented to the Morrison & Associates Board of Directors, along with potential partners from Paris and London. It was the culmination of everything I had worked toward, and ironically, it required exactly the kind of sophisticated international perspective that Diane had always claimed I lacked. My team had grown to 5 specialists, including 2 junior analysts who had specifically requested to work under my supervision after hearing about the harassment case. The office buzz was different now, more collaborative, more inclusive, and significantly more productive. The toxic environment that Diane had created was being replaced by something genuinely innovative, but success had brought unexpected challenges. The industry attention following my case had been overwhelmingly positive, but it had also attracted some uncomfortable scrutiny. A few prominent marketing executives who had worked with Diane over the years were quietly questioning whether her termination had been too harsh for what they characterized as cultural misunderstandings. This perspective came to a head during a networking event at the Seattle Art Museum, where I encountered Bradley Hoffman, a senior executive from a competing firm who had apparently been friendly with Diane for years. He approached me near the contemporary art exhibits with the kind of forced casualness that immediately put me on alert. "Elena, congratulations on your recent promotion," he began, though his tone suggested the congratulations weren't entirely sincere. "I have to say, the industry has been buzzing about your situation with Diane." "Thank you," I replied carefully, unsure where the conversation was heading. "You know, I worked with Diane on several campaigns over the years," Bradley continued. "She's always been passionate, perhaps sometimes too direct, but I never saw anything that seemed malicious. Sometimes I wonder if cultural differences might have been misinterpreted as something more serious." The implication was clear. He was suggesting that my harassment case had been an overreaction to normal European directness. It was exactly the kind of narrative that allowed systematic harassment to continue unchecked. "Bradley, I documented months of deliberate attempts to undermine my career, steal credit for my work, and create a hostile work environment," I said firmly. "The investigation found clear evidence of conspiracy to sabotage client relationships. That's not cultural difference, that's professional misconduct." Of course," he backtracked quickly. "I'm just saying that sometimes these situations are more complex than they appear from the outside." What Bradley didn't know was that his conversation with me was being overheard by Jennifer Walsh, the brand director from the hotel chain who had become one of my strongest professional allies. After Bradley walked away, she approached with a knowing smile. "I see you're still dealing with the old boys network trying to minimize what happened," she said. "Unfortunately, yes. Apparently, some people think systematic harassment is just passionate management." Jennifer's expression hardened. "You know, I never told you this, but we had worked with Diane's previous agency about 5 years ago. She pulled similar stunts. There, taking credit for junior staff work, creating hostile environments, using her cultural background as a shield for inappropriate behavior. We ended that relationship specifically because of her conduct. This was news to me." "Did you report that at the time?" "We complained to the agency leadership, but they brushed it off as personality conflicts. Sound familiar?" Jennifer shook her head. "What you did by documenting everything and demanding accountability, that took real courage. Don't let anyone convince you it was unnecessary." The conversation reinforced something I had been learning over the past few months. Workplace. Harassment often persists because people are willing to tolerate it rather than confront it. The cultural differences excuse was just one of many ways that organizations avoided addressing toxic behavior. This realization became even more relevant the following week when I received an unexpected email from a woman named Amanda Thompson, who worked at a prestigious advertising agency in Portland. She had heard about my case through industry contacts and wanted to share her own experience with a senior manager who used similar tactics. We met for coffee at a small cafe in Pioneer Square, and Amanda's story was depressingly familiar. Her manager, a British executive named David, would make derogatory comments about American work ethic and intelligence, always in his native accent, while claiming that any objections were simply Americans being overly sensitive to direct feedback. He would literally call us colonials during meetings, Amanda explained. When anyone complained, he would laugh and say it was just British humor that we didn't understand. HR always sided with him because he brought in major clients. How long has this been going on? I asked. 3 years. I'm actually the 4th person in my role. The others all left because of the hostile environment he creates. But he's never faced any consequences because clients love his accent and assume he must be brilliant. Amanda's situation illustrated a broader pattern that I had been researching for an upcoming conference presentation. Workplace harassment often involved power dynamics where the harasser used cultural or linguistic advantages to create plausible deniability for their behavior. Have you documented any of this? I asked. Amanda shook her head. I wouldn't even know where to start. And honestly, I'm terrified of retaliation. David has connections throughout the industry. Over the next hour, I walked Amanda through the documentation strategies I had developed. How to record conversations legally, how to create contemporaneous notes, how to identify patterns of behavior, and most importantly, how to build a case that was undeniable rather than interpretive. The key is patience, I explained. Don't try to catch them in one big moment. Instead, document the pattern over time. Eventually, the evidence becomes overwhelming. As we parted ways, Amanda thanked me repeatedly. I never thought about this strategically before. I was just trying to survive each day. That's what they count on, I replied. They create environments where people are too stressed and demoralized to fight back effectively. This conversation sparked an idea that had been percolating since my first conference presentation. There was clearly a need for a more systematic approach to helping employees document and report workplace harassment. Most people facing these situations were isolated, overwhelmed, and unsure how to build a compelling case against someone in a position of power. I proposed the idea to Rebecca Washington during our monthly strategy meeting. What if we created a pro bono consulting service for employees facing workplace harassment? We could provide documentation training, strategic advice, and support throughout the reporting process. Rebecca's eyes lit up. That's brilliant, and it aligns perfectly with our corporate social responsibility goals. We could position Morrison & Associates as a leader in workplace equity advocacy. Within 2 weeks, we had approval to launch the Professional Accountability Project, a confidential resource for employees across the industry who were experiencing harassment or discrimination. The program would provide free consultation, documentation training, and strategic guidance to help people build effective cases against workplace misconduct. The program's first client was Amanda Thompson, who had decided to move forward with documenting David's harassment. Using the strategies we developed, she was able to capture clear evidence of his discriminatory language, his pattern of credit theft, and his deliberate efforts to create a hostile work environment. But Amanda's case also revealed something that my own experience hadn't fully prepared me for: the international complexities of workplace harassment documentation. David's agency had offices in London, and he frequently used his connections there to undermine Portland staff members who challenged his authority. This required us to research international employment law, cross-border corporate policies, and the various legal frameworks that applied to multinational harassment cases. It was complex, time-consuming work that highlighted how sophisticated workplace harassment had become in the global economy. The breakthrough in Amanda's case came when we discovered that David had been making similar comments about American employees during video conferences with the London office. His pattern of cultural harassment wasn't limited to private conversations. He was actively promoting discriminatory attitudes in international corporate communications. When Amanda's agency conducted their investigation, they found that David's behavior had created liability issues under both American employment law and British corporate conduct standards. His termination was swift and decisive, with the agency issuing a formal apology to all affected employees. News of Amanda's successful case spread quickly through industry networks, and the Professional Accountability Project began receiving requests from across the country. Within 6 months, we were consulting on cases involving cultural harassment, linguistic discrimination, and systematic workplace bullying from Seattle to Miami. Each case taught us something new about the evolving nature of workplace harassment and the increasingly sophisticated strategies that bullies used to avoid accountability. But we were also developing equally sophisticated countermeasures, documentation techniques, legal frameworks, and strategic approaches that could penetrate even the most carefully constructed systems of professional misconduct. The most rewarding aspect of this work was seeing how it transformed people's relationship with their own careers. Like me, most of our clients started from a position of feeling powerless and isolated. By the end of the process, they had not only addressed their immediate harassment situation, but had also developed skills and confidence that would protect them throughout their professional lives. As I sat in my office one year after my promotion, reviewing case files and preparing for a national conference on workplace equity, I reflected on how dramatically everything had changed. The small digital recorder that had started this journey was now part of a comprehensive toolkit that we provided to employees across multiple industries. Diane had unwittingly created something much larger than she could have imagined. Her assumption that linguistic privilege would protect her from accountability had sparked a movement that was helping hundreds of people document and overcome similar harassment situations. The irony was perfect. In trying to destroy my career through systematic harassment, she had actually launched me into a position where I could protect others from experiencing the same treatment. Her French insults had become the foundation for a national conversation about workplace accountability. Sometimes the best revenge really is living well and helping others do the same. 2 years had passed since that first recording in the conference room, and I was standing on the stage of the Washington Convention Center addressing an audience of over 3,000 HR professionals, employment lawyers, and corporate executives. The Professional Accountability Project had evolved into a nationally recognized organization, and this keynote presentation was the culmination of everything we had built. Workplace harassment thrives in silence, I began, looking out at the sea of faces. It depends on victims feeling isolated, powerless, and convinced that their experiences don't matter. But when we document the truth systematically and demand accountability consistently, we transform not just individual careers, but entire organizational cultures. In the front row sat Rebecca Washington, now the CEO of Morrison & Associates, and Michelle Rodriguez, who had been recruited to head the Department of Labor's new Workplace Equity Initiative. Their presence reminded me how far we had all come from that first meeting in HR when I was just trying to save my own career. But the most meaningful face in the audience belonged to Marcus Webb, of all people. He had requested a private meeting after the conference, and frankly, I was curious about what he wanted to say. The last time I had seen him was during his termination meeting 2 years earlier. After my presentation concluded to thunderous applause, I made my way backstage where Marcus was waiting with obvious nervousness. He looked older, more subdued, and completely lacking the arrogant confidence that had once made him Diane's perfect accomplice. "Elena, thank you for agreeing to see me," he began hesitantly. I know I have no right to ask for your time, but I needed to apologize in person. I studied his face, looking for signs of manipulation or self-serving motivation, but what I saw was genuine remorse and something that looked like hard-earned humility. I've spent the last 2 years in therapy, trying to understand how I became the kind of person who would participate in systematically destroying someone's career, he continued. I want you to know that what we did to you was inexcusable, and I take full responsibility for my part in it. This was not what I had expected. What changed for you, Marcus? He smiled ruefully. Getting fired was the best thing that ever happened to me, though I didn't realize it at the time. I ended up taking a job at a small nonprofit in Portland, working with at-risk youth. For the first time in my career, I was working for people instead of working against them. Marcus went on to explain that losing his position at Morrison and Associates had forced him to confront the toxic patterns he had developed over years of corporate climbing. I realized I had become someone who gained power by helping more powerful people abuse others. That's not who I wanted to be. Have you spoken to Diane? I asked. His expression darkened. She contacted me about 6 months after we were fired, wanting to start a consulting business together. She seemed to think we had been unfairly targeted and that we could rebuild our careers by positioning ourselves as victims of corporate overreach. What did you tell her? I told her that we weren't victims. We were perpetrators who finally faced consequences for our actions. She didn't take that well. Marcus paused. The last I heard, she was working for a small agency in Vancouver. But I understand she's had trouble finding stable positions. Word travels in this industry. This revelation was oddly satisfying. While I had moved on from seeking personal revenge against Diane, knowing that her behavior had professional consequences felt like justice. Marcus, I appreciate your apology, I said finally. What you did was wrong, but the fact that you've genuinely changed suggests that people can learn from their mistakes. There's something else, he added. I've been following the Professional Accountability Project, and I'd like to volunteer. I know it might seem strange, but I understand how harassment systems work from the inside. Maybe that perspective could be helpful. It was an unexpected request, but as I thought about it, I realized that reformed perpetrators could indeed provide valuable insights into harassment dynamics. Send me a proposal outlining how you think you could contribute. We'll consider it. After Marcus left, I took a moment to process the surreal nature of that conversation. 2 years ago, he had been actively planning my professional destruction. Now he was asking to help protect other people from similar treatment. People really could change, though it apparently required losing everything first. The conference concluded with the announcement of a new federal initiative inspired by the Professional Accountability Project. The Department of Labor would be launching pilot programs in 5 major cities, providing free documentation training and legal support for employees facing workplace harassment. It was exactly the kind of systematic change that individual cases like mine had been building toward. But perhaps the most meaningful development came 3 months later, when I received a handwritten letter from someone I had never expected to hear from again. The return address showed it was from Patricia Blackwell, though she was no longer with the hotel chain. Dear Elena, the letter began, I wanted you to know that your courage in confronting workplace harassment has had impacts that extend far beyond what you might realize. Patricia went on to explain that witnessing how Morrison and Associates had handled my case had inspired her to examine harassment issues within her own organization. What she discovered was a pattern of systematic discrimination against women and minorities that had been operating for years under the cover of high-performance standards. I realized that if I didn't act on what I had learned from your example, I would be complicit in perpetuating the same kind of toxic environment that you had fought to change, the letter continued. Patricia had initiated a comprehensive investigation that ultimately led to the resignation of 3 senior executives and the implementation of industry-leading equity policies. She had recently been recruited to serve as Chief Diversity Officer for a Fortune 500 company, specifically because of her demonstrated commitment to meaningful organizational change. "Your case taught me that real change requires real courage," she concluded. "Thank you for showing all of us what accountability looks like." Reading that letter in my office, the same corner office where this entire journey had led me, I felt a sense of completion that I hadn't expected. The professional accountability project had helped hundreds of people. The policy changes had protected thousands more. But knowing that the ripple effects were still spreading through corporate America felt like the ultimate validation. That evening, I was cleaning out old files when I came across the small digital recorder that had started everything. It was outdated now, replaced by more sophisticated documentation tools that we provided to our clients. But I kept it as a reminder of how small actions could lead to enormous changes. My assistant knocked on the door. "Elena, there's a young woman here who says she needs help with a workplace situation. She doesn't have an appointment, but she seems really upset." I looked at the clock. It was nearly 7 p.m., well past normal business hours. "Send her in." The woman who entered was probably in her mid-20s, clearly distressed, and clutching a manila folder like it contained her entire future. She reminded me of myself 2 years earlier. Intelligent, determined, but overwhelmed by a situation that felt impossible to navigate alone. "Ms. Carter, I'm sorry to come without an appointment," she began. "But I heard about the work you do, and I didn't know where else to turn." "What's your name?" I asked gently. "Jessica Chen. I work for a tech startup here in Seattle, and my manager has been, well, he's been making my life hell for months. But he's very careful about it, and I'm worried that no one will believe me if I report it." I gestured for her to sit down. "Tell me what's been happening." What followed was a familiar story. Systematic, undermining, credit theft, deliberate exclusion from opportunities, and subtle but persistent harassment designed to force her resignation. The details were different, but the pattern was achingly recognizable. "Do you have any documentation?" I asked. Jessica opened her manila folder and pulled out a notebook filled with handwritten entries, dates, times, and detailed descriptions of incidents. "I started writing everything down after I heard about your case. I thought maybe if I could prove what was happening." I looked at her careful documentation and felt a surge of pride and hope. She had learned from my example and was already building a strong case against her harasser. The cycle was continuing. Each person who stood up to workplace harassment was making it easier for the next person to do the same. "Jessica, you've done excellent work documenting this," I said. "Let's talk about your options." As we spent the next hour developing her strategy, I realized that this was what success really looked like. Not the corner office, not the speaking engagements, not even the policy changes, though all of those mattered. Real success was measured in the courage that people found to stand up for themselves because they knew they weren't alone. Diane had tried to destroy my career using the assumption that linguistic privilege would protect her from consequences. Instead, she had created a movement that was systematically dismantling the very systems that had protected harassers for generations. 2 years later, workplace harassment was no longer a private shame that people endured in silence. It was a documented, addressable problem with clear solutions and real consequences for perpetrators. The small recorder that had captured Diane's French insults had become something much larger, proof that in the right circumstances, truth really could triumph over power, and that sometimes the best revenge was simply refusing to stay silent. As Jessica left my office that night with a clear plan and renewed confidence, I realized that Diane's biggest mistake hadn't been underestimating my French comprehension or my willingness to document harassment. Her biggest mistake had been teaching me that systematic oppression required systemic resistance, and that once people learned how to fight back effectively, they would teach others to do the same. The conversation she thought no one could understand had become a conversation that everyone was having. Looking for more? We've got 2 amazing stories ready for you right on screen. If this one touched you, these are absolutely worth your time. Click to watch them now. And hey, subscribe and hit that bell to never miss our latest uploads.